Alright, kita dah start live. Sekejap ya. You guys can hear my voice pretty well, okay. Okay kan? Suara kuat kan?
Yep, suara kuat.
Alright, thank you. Okay, we're going to start now. Alright, Assalamualaikum and a very good day to all present today. Welcome to the third round of English Debate Competition, InterVarsity Science E-Debate Challenge 2021. The motion for this debate is, this House believes that Star Trek is more scientifically sound than Star Wars. Okay, I will be the chairperson and the timekeeper for room number 1. Let me now introduce the debaters to you. Okay, acting as the government team for this debate is the team from with Miss Catherine Alicia Nathan as the Prime Minister, Mr. Danesh Ram Agarwal as the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Kuhan Karthikeyan as the Government Whip, and the reserve is Mr. Danesh Ram Agarwal. Okay, the next is acting as the opposition team for this debate is the team from Sunway with Miss Gitanjali as the opposition leader, Miss Shireen as the second opposition speaker, Miss Wen Juin as the opposition whip, and the reserve is Miss Shireen. Okay, our panel of adjudicators consists of Mr. Muhammad Ibrahim bin Burhanuddin, Miss Dina Batrisha binti Adi Azhar, Mr. Matthew anak lelaki Ernest Paul, and Mr. Amir Shazwan bin Zaili. Now we come to our debate today. To open the case from the government team, I call upon the Prime Minister to start the debate session.
All right, if you have P1s, just put them in the private chat and I will get to them. In the interest of ensuring that this debate happens as clearly and as engaging as possible, I'm going to spend a large amount of my speech establishing the universes of Star Trek and Star Wars, the metrics of what is considered scientifically sound, and then onto my principal argument as to why the nature of Star Trek was made to be more accurate to science. But firstly, what does the universe of Star Wars look like? I think there are three elements that we can focus on. The Force, lightsabers, and hyperspeed travel. The Force is a projection of chosen individuals that have been chosen by this specific power to manipulate and gravitational and physical aspects of nature. This looks like being able to conduct mind control or moving rocks. Lightsabers, on the other hand, are focused beams of energy conducted by space crystals to create a penetrating force which is used as weapons in the universe of Star Wars. Hyperspace travel, on the other hand, is not really explained, but it is generally something which spaceships can use, for example, the Millennium Falcon, which allows them to travel from one edge of the universe to another as if through a portal. Star Trek, on the other hand, as a whole, is not a linear universe as Star Wars is. So Star Wars follows a direct progression of events from Luke Skywalker down to Kylo Ren, whereas Star Trek, the linear progression of Star Trek and all 13 movies is quite jumbled up. I think the initial 6 movies and the subsequent movies after that don't really follow the same parameters, as the directors that have changed throughout the movies use different scientific laws as well, which is completely fine because this is how franchises work. So for the purposes of this debate, we will prioritize the original series of Star Trek versus the original and sequel trilogy of Star Wars for 2 reasons. We think, firstly, this is a fair comparison to make because these universes were created around the same time and is appropriate given that Star Wars and Star Trek were competing franchises at the time. But also, secondly, we think these earlier movies are a closer approximation to the true nature and intention of the creators, as franchises usually deviate as more movies progress. So these are the movies that we would like to focus on that will provide the most equitable clash in this debate. We think the main facet of Star Trek at the end of the day was to integrate scientific concepts into plot lines. For example, identifying hyperspeed travel as not only something that is used used by spaceships, but explaining the process behind it and making it a plausible scientific concept of how spacecrafts have the possibility of approaching the speed of light. This is explained in the Star Trek franchise as cosmic strings, which is essentially a shortcut between universes. Note that the comparative is in Star Wars, this explanation was absent. I think there are also similarities between both franchises. Firstly, there are like aliens and different races and different characteristics that belong to each races. For example, some races, big furry giants like Chewbacca, or others are able to shoot beams out of their eyes. We think both franchises also use the concept of advanced robots that are capable of sentience. So we think these are similarities between both franchises. Now that I've established both universes and which movies we're going to compare, moving on to my principal argument as to why the nature of Star Trek in and of itself is more accurate to science. I think the reason why Star Wars is extremely popular was because it created an imaginative world that people never really envisioned before. This looks like lightsabers, the Force, and the connection that people have to the Force. How spacecrafts are built, for example, the Death Star, which was the size of an entire planet. Note that in the context of when these movies were released, there was nothing that could compare to Star Wars, right? But the questions that Star Wars do not answer are quite clear. They don't really answer how the Death Star is built, how hyperspace is available, how the Force chooses people. So although it is immersive and easy to enjoy for people, and because of the nature of the special effects in Star Wars, which at the time was extremely advanced and extremely immersive, we think this is what allowed for the popularity of Star Wars to continue, right? Simply because people were able to immerse it and view it as a science fantasy universe instead of a science fiction universe. The purpose of the films, essentially, of Star Wars was to display special effects and their advancement at this time and date. But we think this didn't really adhere to the purpose of science fiction, because although Star Wars had interest, because although science fictions at that time were existent, they weren't really popular due to horrible side effects. So it's difficult to immerse yourself in these movies. So even devoid of explanations as to how the science in Star Wars actually works, people didn't really mind because the immersion into the fantasy was what they were buying into and what they loved. But the stark problem that it created, especially for people that wanted to consume science fiction or people that were interested in science in general, was that people weren't really given insight into the accurate lore that Star Wars depicted. People were annoyed and they couldn't really rationalize the elements of Star Wars. Hence, this is where Star Trek came in. This is a direct response to Star Wars as a whole, where the creators envisioned a dystopian universe where scientific advancements were possible. And the stark difference between Star Trek and Star Wars was that they were able to define key concepts of science properly. This looks like explaining hyperspace and how it is attached to cosmic strings, explaining atmospheric pressure, where the people in the Star Trek universe had to use suits to prevent themselves from exploding due to the pressure of space, or even just landing on different planets and using these suits to combat this atmospheric pressure. This also looks like accessing black holes to reach the depth of space. All of these concepts were not only present in Star Trek, but also explained to an extent which allows for people to believe that these scientific concepts are plausible at the end of the day. We think Star Trek also strayed away from special effects that Star Wars used. So instead of lightsabers that looked flashy and cool, Star Trek used more practical objects such as guns. The explanation of alien races in Star Trek as well was extremely different. So although alien races existed in both movies, Star Trek was able to explain how these races were shaped by the environment and the characteristics that are unique to each race, while Star Trek never really explains why Chewbacca is so big and furry and is able to talk to Han Solo. While Star Trek, at the end of the day, is an exaggeration of scientific concepts, there's a clear explanation to explain why this is possible. And we think this, at the end of the day, makes Star Trek more scientifically true or scientifically plausible as compared to Star Wars. In regards to the perspective of fans as well, there is a reason why fans generally consider Star Trek to be more scientifically true as compared to Star Wars. We think fans of science fiction in general will always say that Star Trek is better because it explains these key concepts and allows people insights into what these scientific concepts are used as in regards to space and outer world exploration. At the end of the day, we think that Star Trek is more true to what science really is.
Thank you for that speech. The timing was 7 minutes and 20 seconds. Alright, to open the case from the opposition team, I call upon the leader of opposition to continue the debate session.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So in the info slide, Star Wars, it says that Star Wars is classified as a science fantasy, whereas Star Trek is classified or is thought to be science fiction. However, just because of the difference in genre, there's nothing to say that the elements in Star Trek are any more feasible than the elements in Star Wars. Prime Minister says that it talks about the reason why Star Trek was made, that because people felt like Star Wars was not scientifically accurate and such, but I feel like Gov fails to recognize that Star Trek is still fiction. It's exaggerated fiction, and it's equally as unfeasible as Star Wars. Now, Gov also talks about Gov talks a lot about explaining the science in Star Trek because they take a lot of time in their episodes to explain the science behind the things. But Gov fails to recognize that Star Trek is a show with more time, and it is a science fiction. So the focus in Star Trek is more on the science, whereas in Star Wars, the focus is more on the action. So Star Trek takes more time to explain the science behind the things they're doing because that's the basis of the show. However, that doesn't mean that the science is accurate or that it is plausible or feasible in our modern world because it is fiction and it's exaggerated. For an example would be that in one of the episodes in Star Trek, they talk about how spiders are related to humanity's ancestry, which is extremely inaccurate and completely false. Gov also talks about Chewbacca in detail and other elephants, other elements of other aliens in the Star Wars world. But we don't actually know what aliens look like in our current world. We don't know if aliens look more similar to humans or look completely like different have different features and are different in their anatomy. That's because we don't know what they look like. And the only reason that the Star Trek franchise has more human-looking alien cast members is because Star Wars uses a lot of costumes and a lot of CGI to create their aliens, whereas Star Trek focused on using human cast members instead. Now onto some definitions. This debate is about the scientific feasibility of this of each franchise. Now, scientific feasibility is relating to the technology that we have in our modern world and whether we can replicate the things that they have in these franchises, whether we can create that with modern science that we have in today's world. And now Star Wars, similarities between both franchises include planets, warp speed, and hyperspeed travel, which government talks about being unfeasible but in Star Wars, but is the same thing that you have in Star Trek. The differences would be that Star Wars has the Force and has lightsabers and talks about the good and evil fight, and Star Trek has stun guns and teleportation. However, teleportation, Gov talks about how Star Trek science is more feasible, but let's take teleportation for example. Teleportation is not feasible at all because we have quantum physics that has proven that teleportation is only possible for pieces of information. It is impossible for objects with matter, objects of matter with particles to teleport, and that is because the forces are too strong and it would get deconstructed, and therefore it's completely unfeasible in modern technology, and this has been debunked by scientists before. So both worlds are equally scientifically unfeasible. Therefore, we can't, even regardless of the fact that the Force exists in the Star Wars world, we still can't create a world with the technology in Star Trek. We cannot. It is not something we can attain faster than Star Wars. It's not even something that we can foresee that will be in our future. We do not see us creating a world where we have the same modern technology that is in Star Trek. It is not scientifically sound. The technology doesn't make any sense because it is, at the end of the day, exaggerated fiction. In Star Trek, the Star Trek world is depicted post destruction of the Earth, and it is about how they don't need. It's just simply about the ethics and exploration, but it doesn't. There is simply the fact that both of them are franchises. Both of them it is fiction at the end of the day. They both have scientific elements. And while one world is more fantasy based, both worlds have science that is completely unfeasible in the future of the world, regardless of how far we look, because it has already been debunked. And with that, I am proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, I would like to thank the speaker for their speech. The timing was 6 minutes and 45 seconds. 6 minutes, 45 seconds. All right, to continue our debate today, I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for their side.
Thank you. I hope I am audible.
Yes.
Thank you. I think government fails in this debate because the motion requires them to prove one of two things. Either they significantly tell you why Star Wars is more scientifically sound than Star Trek, or both of them are on equal footing in terms of scientific soundness, which I don't think opposition has successfully done. For all the arguments or premises that you have heard from leader of opposition, it is to clarify on how Star Trek is fictional also, which is not something that government is disagreeing with. We are simply stating that the difference between Star Wars and Star Trek is that Star Wars utilize the imaginative nature of what space looks like and what space could look like, and wove this into an action-packed special effect saga about aliens, about special humans who can use the Force. While Star Trek, its entire plot over 13 movies is about a group of human hybrids and humans exploring the depths of space, looking for new species to discover and to research. And a lot of these plot devices were based on initial foundational scientific concepts. So yes, Star Trek has things like hyperspace and warp travel, which is impossible even in the current time. However, they attempted to explain by using terms like cosmic strings, which are highways which you can use to reach point A to point B in galaxies in the shortest time possible. So it's basically not achieving light speed travel, but it's more of exploiting the possible shortcuts throughout the universe in order to reach point B at the fastest time possible. These are all scientific concepts which at that time or even to some extent now, are still scientifically sound because we don't have the capacity to test. But theoretically, it is more possible than in the world of Star Wars, where massive 20-ton ships can glide through the edges of space through a intergalactic tunnel and then reach point A at point B, going faster than the speeds of light, one edge of the galaxy to another. The second reason is the second reason is a lot of the arguments that you hear from leader of opposition or opposition down the line is things like Star Trek has aliens too. Star Trek is not real. Star Trek is done by Hollywood. It is also fiction. These are all things that we don't disagree. There are similarities between both franchises, but how they tackle these differences is the key value of this debate on discussing scientific soundness. For example, both Star Trek and Star Wars has blasters that can emit rays of light that can have a penetrative force. In Star Wars, you get this penetrative force by crystallizing a specific material in order to generate this heat, which is not plausible because no substance exists, nor can it exist in the size of the guns that are used in Star Wars. Nor is there any attempt to explain how these blasters came into fruition in the movies. However, in Star Trek, the blasters, which are called phasers, are described as a specific substance going through a refractive material in order to create a phase beam, which can then generate the penetrating power that Star Trek talks about. While this force or penetrating power is obviously exaggerated with multiple colors to advance the plot line, the foundation of this process is on scientific principles of refraction, which is more sound than a blaster being used in Star Wars. These are all examples of how devices that are used in these movies are catering to different demographics, which is a response that opposition has yet to give. Catherine has already explained to you why Star Trek was made for a specific demographic who were dissatisfied or were unable to appreciate the plot of Star Wars because it was more closely tied to movies like Lord of the Rings or the movie Dune, because it was more fantasy based. It was not akin to sci-fi, it was more of magic. How can the Death Star be the size of a small moon but capable of desecrating multiple planets over the course of minutes? Um, how Darth Vader, who lost an entire half of his body, can be regenerated with cyberkinetic parts and still be the most powerful force user in the universe. These are all examples when you compare to Star Trek. For example, how Spock is just a hybrid of a human and Vulcan, another carbon-based being, and utilizing as much scientific devices as possible to bridge the gap of the superhumans that exists in both universes of Star Wars and Star Trek, which makes it more plausible than simply being able to mind control. The next layer of argumentation is also comparing the level of scientific foundations that have been existing in real world users today. But before that, any questions? Okay, no. Another aspect of scientific soundness is to see how much of technology in Star Trek has been applied to current worlds. If you look at Data, one of the androids that is used in Star Trek, it has already been applied to NASA technology, where Data uses mechanical components to move cyberkinetic parts of human beings. So Stephen Hawking, who uses a specific mechanical component in order to create a voice modulator that can express his voice, are examples of how technology that existed in the 1960s in a movie is applied in the real world today. Or for deflector beams for camouflage, which is used by the ISS in order to deflect the sunbeams, the rays of the sun, to mask its position in the atmosphere. These are all instances and examples of technology used in this franchise, while exaggerated or at its initial process, being able to be continuously developed in order to reach this stage of plausibility, which goes to show that we apply this metric of scientific soundness to show why Star Trek is more plausible than Star Wars. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
All right, I would like to thank the speaker for their remarks. The timing was 7 minutes and 17 seconds. All right, now I call upon the deputy leader of opposition to continue the case for their side.
Hi, I'm really sorry. Can I just go to the bathroom real quick?
Yep, sure.
All right, thank you very much. Really sorry.
It's okay.
Hi, really sorry. Am I audible?
Yes.
I'm gonna hope that I am audible. All right, so starting my speech. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I think one of the flaws coming out of the government bench is the refusal to want to actually talk about the scientific elements found within both franchises and directly compare whether or not the feasibility of those elements is sound or not. So I'm going to do a few things in my speech today. I'm going to, number one, just recharacterize the debate and put the framing back in the favor of the opposition. Number two, I'm going to respond to a large chunk of what the government's case rests on, and I'm going to give arguments of the opposition's own. So the first thing is the burden that we had to prove on the opposition's case. All we have to prove to you is that both of these worlds of Star Trek and Star Wars are equally unfeasible, regardless of the number of unfeasible elements within each of these franchises. So long as we can prove that Star Trek also employs elements of science fiction that we just cannot develop in the real world, it's enough to prove to you that Star Trek is at the very least and on the same level of being as unfeasible as like Star Wars, and that directly engages what the DLO accuses of not wanting to do. Which means there's DLO's second point about how like more of the technology in Star Trek has been inspired in the real world doesn't necessarily hold any water, because so long as I can prove to you in my substantives that there are in fact elements of Star Trek that we cannot develop, then we can safely prove to you that Star Trek is just scientifically not sound. Let's talk about the responses to the government case, and this is largely in terms of like the metric that they put out in terms to measure the debate. They wanted to argue on the grounds of the inception of Star Trek and Star Wars being inherently different in that Star Trek was conceived to be more scientifically accurate. We say that as an unfair way to talk about the debate or to take into account the original purpose of the franchise, because I can argue that number one, the main incentive was actually for entertainment, not to pander to fans for scientific representation. And even if it was for that, it doesn't do a good job of scientific representation anyway, since all of the elements in it are still hyperbole and exaggerated. The fact that it resonated with fans on the topic of it being like more scientifically relatable, it doesn't matter, because number one, that's just a facet of entertainment. It's going to happen regardless. And number two, just because it resonates with fans or just because it was propagated to be more scientifically accurate doesn't mean that it is scientifically accurate. Secondly, I feel like the motion's most fair interpretation is to call for a debate in the vacuum, in that you've got to compare the two worlds in terms of what kind of feasibility you can achieve in them. So you can't compare the two in the same way you can't justify an action based on its intention. Sure, you can acknowledge that someone did something bad to you, even if the original intention was good, but you have to also take into account what that action means, regardless of the intention and regardless of the reason why Star Trek was created. So you've got to talk about the plot elements propagated being just scientifically sound based on the modern sciences that we already know. So my speech and my substantives are going to be very simple. As long as I can prove to you that in the government's best case, when they talk to us about how Star Trek still propagates like theories that can somehow still be applied in science, so long as I can prove to you that those theories are still inaccurate in Star Trek, and be even in the best case why those theories still cannot exist in our world, we can safely prove to you that Star Trek is in fact at the very least on the same unfeasible grounds as Star Wars. So let's first talk about the argument about how Star Trek employs fundamental scientific principles behind its plot so that it can somehow be a little bit more realistic. That was a chunk of the DLO's argument about how like Star Wars is purely fantasy, but Star Trek has some element of realism. Recognize that justification alone doesn't automatically necessitate scientific soundness, because the premise on that argument is that as long as you explain something, that something is now representative of science or representative of truth. Recognize that's a logical fallacy, because explanations can be wrong, explanations can be misguided, and they can't be they can be a fake or a fraudulent representation of what the true thing actually is. Which means even if Star Trek claims to use string theory or any kind of like curvature, space-time curvature theory to explain how it can achieve time travel, that doesn't mean that those explanations are valid or legitimate insofar as those explanations cannot bring about those scientific developments in the real world. Which means regardless of Star Trek having these foundational principles, quote unquote, as the backbone of its plot, justifying the plot elements being more or less justifying the plot elements being less fictional because of that simply isn't true, because these technologies are still impossible. Next part is going to be quite simple. I'm just going to talk to you about the elements of Star Trek that just can't be scientifically feasible. So there's three main things that make Star Trek what it is. Firstly is warp speed, and like how, the ship gets to travel at hyperspeed, faster than the speed of light. Second is teleportation with the famous, beam me up, Scotty. And third and lastly is, of course, time travel. So I'm just going to talk to you very quickly about why each of these elements is impossible to be developed in the real world, which means all of the arguments that are coming out of government bench about how we still employ some sort of like foundational theory can't stand, because at the end of the day, the elements or the conclusions that we champion for are just not feasible anyway. So let's look at the first thing about warp speed. So like government bench agrees that hyperspeed applies to both sides, and like both Star Wars and Star Trek anyway. But I'm just going to very quickly tell you that it's literally impossible to travel faster than the speed of light as dictated by special relativity, which means that the only object able to travel at the speed of light is something that has no mass, which means the ships that as you see in Star Trek and Star Wars simply can't do that, because the mass of the warp speed engine itself would just negate its ability to like fly faster than the speed of light, which means that like regardless of the theory that like some news outlets propagate, that Star Wars uses the idea of like string theory Star Trek uses the idea of string theory to justify warp speed. At the end of the day, the technology it propagates is still impossible, so we don't see why that somehow justifies or validates its scientific soundness. Before I go on, any questions? I'm more than open to one.
Yeah, I have a POI. Our argument is to prove that Star Trek is more scientifically sound as compared to Star Wars, because there are elements that can be applied. This doesn't exist in a vacuum. Please respond.
Two responses. One, I do think it does in fact exist in a vacuum, because by your very logic, if you want to apply to me that, Star Wars or Star Trek has elements that we can apply in real life, then you are taking into account the fact that Star Trek has elements within its own universe outside of like inside of the fictional dimension that we can apply in real life as well. But secondly, I would argue again that it's not necessarily about the number of objects that we can apply within each of these franchises into the real world. It's still the fact that both of these franchises or both of these worlds are unfeasible in and of themselves. Just because Star Wars has the added like fantasy elements of the Force, the Death Star, and like Darth Vader, all those things, doesn't mean that somehow we're going to be able to achieve a world like Star Trek faster, that somehow we're going to be able to develop technology that resembles Star Trek's in a faster way. Which means that if you imagine the debate as a race, it does no indication that somehow we're going to be able to get to a world like Star Trek faster than Star Wars, simply because both of the elements within these worlds are unfeasible. Second thing I'm going to talk about, why teleportation is impossible. So like the beam me up Scotty element of Star Trek is literally impossible, because you can't teleport anything that is bigger than a quantum particle, because that would require A, immense amounts of energy, and B, matter can't travel past the speed of light, which is a prerequisite for teleportation. Which means this in and of itself, one of the main proponents of the Star Trek franchise, which is beam me up Scotty, the most iconic line in Star Trek, I'd say, is just impossible to do. The third thing is, of course, time travel. I don't think I have to explain this in depth. You can't travel back in time because of the rules of time and space-time curvature. And for all those reasons, because of the impossibility of the elements within Star Trek, you can't say that it's scientifically sound, and you have to debate on the grounds that you just can't reach a world like Star Trek in status quo based on the science we have. For all those reasons, oppose.
All right, I would like to thank the speaker for their remarks. The timing was 7 minutes and 9 seconds. All right, so ladies and gentlemen and the honorable adjudicators, I shall now call upon the government whip to rebut.
Can I just confirm if I'm audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. Judge, I'm going to start off my speech by explaining what exactly is the caveat in this debate and what exactly both sides have to defend. Because it became extremely confusing by the statement made by the speaker before me, and that is the fact that they're burdened just to prove that both franchises has their inaccuracy and implausibility into making sure science is something that is accurate. Therefore, at the same time, all they have to prove is Star Trek is impossible to uphold. The reason why this is an unfair burden to hold is because the debate calls for us to argue which franchise has more plausibility in terms of scientific accuracy. This debate clearly shows in the motion we have to prove on either side which show or movie is more scientifically sound. So if your burden is to say that both sides or both franchises isn't scientifically sound, then where is the debate? The debate's about a zero-sum game, which you ought to prioritize and prove which is more accurate. In that sense, we've been very consistent. And also note, even if that was the debate and both sides were impossible or implausible to begin with, all of Deputy Leader of Opposition's arguments on how teleportation is impossible and things like that are all arguments to assume or insinuate that it's only specifically unfeasible for Star Trek to be scientifically accurate. Under that logic of your argumentation, you're also debating on the ground that you want to prove that Star Trek is to some extent less of scientifically accurate than what Star Wars is. So, firstly, you're pushing an unfair burden. Secondly, to some extent, you're also fulfilling the burden that you want. It's an inconsistent case altogether. In my speech, I'm going to resolve the main issue, which is in which world do we bring closer to an approximation of scientific accuracy? And within this issue, I'll debate what are the metrics that we use into determining why Star Wars is more scientifically sound and accurate, and more importantly, why is that accuracy important in terms of the practicality of it, which we'll talk about closely. The first, why do we think Star Wars, to a large extent, isn't scientifically sound? We think this can be proven in one of two ways. The first is in terms of the absence of scientific explanation, which we think is very important into determining why is it scientifically sound. And secondly, they actively have illustrations that go against science. Let's talk about the latter first, how they actively go against science. I think both my speakers, Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, gave you exhaustive lists examples in which Star Wars simply did not adhere towards basic scientific principles. I'm going to extend on it further. On the idea of, like, for example, planets also in Star Wars, they have like a cold planet, they have a wild jungle planet, they have like an ice planet. So all these things on a very basic level go against principles of science, because we know habitable places possess like complex ecosystems with varying levels of water, for example, or other essentials from one region to another. It's important to posit, while both shows have some levels of exaggeration, we need to assess which levels has more elements of fantasy that is devoid of science, and we argue that it's Star Wars. To a large extent, Star Wars doesn't adhere towards basic scientific principles, and we think it's inaccurate for them to say it is scientifically sound. And we think even in this debate, it's difficult to find actual metrics of comparison to say, hey, for example, this is one comparison that we can see in both movies and this is scientifically sound. Because there is no one definitive example that we can compare, we have to compare it based on the whole plot and where the idea is all reliant on, and the specific theories that we have to unfortunately cherry pick, and that's inevitable in debate in order to show a bigger picture. But we also give an example that is clashing on both worlds, on the idea of weapons, on how phasers that we use in Star Trek have much more adherence towards scientific accuracy by explaining refraction of light, rather than some random arbitrary material that we don't know exists, and how somehow it can possess penetrative properties under the world of Star Wars. So we think even in examples where we can pick that compares that happens in both worlds, Star Trek has more scientific accuracy. Star Wars, to a large extent, doesn't adhere to its basic scientific principles, so they cannot simply say that it's scientifically accurate. Secondly, is the absence of scientific theory, and this is important. I think to a large extent, Star Wars franchise was based on fantasies and special effects, and they are devoid of scientific explanation towards the intricacies of what they do. This is particularly important because DLO's only, I feel, credible clash in this debate was on the idea of wrong explanation, and this is where I will point to you why that's much better in our world under those circumstances. Within the absence of scientific theory under Star Wars, they don't explain how exactly lightsabers can be penetrative and cut like flesh of human beings and other aliens without actually acknowledging what the properties of the material are and how is it logically feasible, means that the lack of response means that there's no adherence towards logic, no adherence towards anything related towards science. Why is Star Trek better? We think to a large extent they explain logical explanations or logical framework in which this thing can happen that is closest approximation towards science. For example, the cosmic string theory, which is the idea that the closest way in which you can get point A to point B in space is to find like a cosmic string, which is essentially a highway. Like, why is this logical as opposed to Star Wars that goes portal by portal? Is because even if the theory is exaggerated or to a large extent not proven in status quo, it has a logical reason. And science is about, like we learned this in Tadika, like science is to explain natural phenomena in the most logical way possible. And insofar like how we have practical applications of Pythagoras theorem, for example, in maths and science research to show the shortest way possible, those things are used in application and are practicable within the Star Trek theory, where scientists and also average layperson can actually synthesize what exactly it means logically and how exactly those things are explained. We think even if those explanations are wrong, it is actually good because to some extent people actually discuss whether or not this theory is possible, whether or not there is some scientific involvements in this, and whether or not we can make it more scientifically sound. Under the world of opposition, the lack of response, which means an average lay person who watches Star Trek will just feel it's all mystical, all fantasy, there is no adherence towards science. This debate doesn't only have to look at scientific experts, which will probably debunk both the scientific theories in both worlds, but an average lay person and how they digest consumable pieces of scientific explanation. And that's what we provide, some level of logic, some level of weighing you the process of how those things work. We think the digestible pieces of logic shows that scientific soundness is more likely in our world. I think the practical outcomes of it is that people can appreciate the scientific analysis more and make more research on that, therefore showing that the show in of itself is more scientifically sound. Opposition loses debate very clearly because on one hand they fail to have a consistent burden, on the other hand they didn't tell us how illustratively on a basic level how an average lay person is able to feel that scientific soundness is more likely in their world. For all those reasons, very proud to propose.
All right, I would like to thank the speaker for that speech. The timing was 7 minutes and 8 seconds. All right, it is now time to listen to the rebuttals of opposition with.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, on both sides, we all have this confusion on whether side opposition's burden is to prove that Star Trek is Star Trek is sound, but instead what we have to prove on opposition side is that Star Trek is not more scientifically sound, but almost the equal. Star Trek is not more scientifically sound than Star Wars, but almost on the equal level of Star Wars, in which they are both equally scientifically unsound. So what's scientifically unsound? As my second speaker has mentioned, scientifically unsound is basically not having the technology and the scientific knowledge to do these certain to carry out and have these certain elements in these films in status quo right now. So our burden is to prove that they are both equally unsound, and not that Star Wars is less sound. It's not that Star Trek is more unsound than Star Wars. So okay, so I'll start off with the government's main case, which is basically they just mention over and over again that these natures of the films themselves and the explanation of the films themselves is what they consider as scientific basis of whether something is achievable or not. They've told you that in Star Wars, because it's used for fantasy, there's no explanations, which means that it's scientifically inaccurate. And just because they said that there's explanations in Star Trek, it immediately makes Star Trek more scientifically accurate. But we know that both in Star Wars and in Star Trek is also a sci-fi with over-exaggerated fantastical universes and world, which my second speaker has mentioned. And because of that, explanations in these films don't carry any weight at all. They have explanations to make it more convincing for viewers to believe in the universe and fully immerse themselves in these universes. But we have to recognize that the basis on which we consider whether this film is scientifically acceptable and sound is not by the explanations in the film. It's by what we can actually achieve and what's been done in scientific research. Because these explanations in the film, as my second speaker has mentioned, aren't the same as they aren't explanations in documentaries of how something works. They are usually made up with bits of scientific elements that aren't 100% developed or aren't 100% relevant to the actual case of how an element works or how something is done in the film. So because these explanations carry no weight in these films, we don't see how government constantly mentioning like, oh, there's explanations in Star Trek, therefore it's more accurate. They have explanations, but these explanations don't have to be 100% accurate because they are just used in a making of a fiction film. So with that, we've also shown you how, teleportation and traveling at the speed of light, there's no explanation of this in the film. And even if there is explanation of this in the film, it's really unlikely that this explanation is true because in scientific research in real life, my first speaker has already told you that teleportation is impossible. You have to break and disassemble people and parts into a lot of information bits, and you have to reassemble them together. And also how, like, my speaker has told you about how it needs a lot of power, how it's just physically impossible in status quo right now with the technology that we have, and also how it takes very long to happen. So another part of what government did is they gave us like certain elements of the film in Star Trek that are used in real life, but what they never did was engage with how our side mentioned that there's technology that there are certain elements, for example, traveling at the speed of light and also teleporting is totally impossible in status quo with the technology that we have. So similar, let's take a comparison. For example, let's say Star Trek is feasible based on its elements, right? So let's take a car as a comparison. And this car doesn't have engine, but it has other parts. So what the government is doing is telling us the elements that the car has, for example, doors to protect people from flying out, airbags and whatnot, elements that will work. But what they don't do is they are not engaging and acknowledging that no engine in the car means the car can't work. Similar to how this debate is going is that they only acknowledge the elements in Star Trek that are similar to what we have in real life, but they don't acknowledge the ones that we've mentioned that are unachievable at all on our side. So what we've done on our side of the house is basically we've given you how elements how we've told you how the film depends on all elements to work, and there are big elements which are teleporting and time and traveling at the speed of light, which are completely unachievable. And we've also given you scientific evidence of how this works and why it's unachievable. And because of that, we've proven that Star Trek is equally as unsound, equally as unachievable in today's society as Star Wars. They are both not achievable at all. And because of that, we believe that we take this debate because our burden is to prove that they are both equally as unsound, and our burden is not to prove that Star Trek is more achievable than Star Wars. And yeah, do you guys have any POIs? No. Okay. Also, the whip mentioned about how the cosmic string theory as an example, how it's used as an explanation in how certain elements work. But we see how their explanations in fiction are not completely true, because in reality, in real life, there is currently no evidence of cosmic strings in the universe. And even if they are evident, what scientists have said is that they are not abundant and they are very limited. So it's proven how evidence and explanation in fictional films are usually made up, and although they do contain a bit of science bits, they are not 100% developed and they are not 100% relevant to the actual thing. It's just used as propaganda to propagate that this is a fictional film indeed. And with that, we believe that we take the debate.
All right, thank you. The timing was 6 minutes and 10 seconds. All right, so now that we have heard all the three speakers from both teams, we shall take a short break of 1 minute. During this time, both the government and the opposition teams will prepare the reply speech.
Am I audible?
Yeah. It's fine. I will continue my script first.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay. All right. The time of 1 minute has ended. I shall now invite the opposition leader from the opposition team to deliver the reply speech.
Okay. So I feel like Gov has completely ignored and simply cherry picked what they found wrong with the Star Wars world and has ignored the issues or the inaccuracies in the science in the Star Trek world, because they simply talked about lightsabers and the string theory continuously, but um, did not talk about the fact that teleportation is completely unfeasible. That warp speed, which happens in both worlds, and hyperdrive is completely unfeasible. And it is literally impossible to travel faster than the speed of light. They have completely ignored all of these. They've also not acknowledged the fact that no, sorry. Side government has also talked about aliens and planets, when these are all simply exaggerated fiction in both worlds. There are we've already given reasons why Star Trek explains the science more than Star Wars, and that is no reason to say that the science in Star Trek is accurate or is feasible. And I feel like because Star Trek uses science like traveling at light speed and travel and using teleportation, which we've already seen in multiple Star Trek franchises. We've already seen in multiple science fiction franchises, so we're used to the idea of teleportation being used. Doesn't mean that it is actually something we will be using in the near future in modern science. It is completely not feasible, and that's why opposition should take this debate, because we have proven that the Star Trek world's technology and science is equally as unfeasible as the world of Star Wars. It's just that Star Wars doesn't give us theories and doesn't go into the details or the nitty-gritty of the science, because the focus or the selling point of that franchise is the action. Whereas the selling point or the focus of the Star Trek franchise is the science and the explanation. And that's what differentiates both franchises. That is the whole difference in genre. But simply because of a difference in genre, it doesn't mean that Star Trek is more technologically sound, more scientifically accurate than the Star Trek world. With that, I oppose. I oppose. Thank you.
All right. Okay. I would like to thank the speaker for that speech. The timing was 3 minutes and 16 seconds. So I shall now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister from the government team to deliver their reply speech.
Thank you.
All right.
Government wins this debate on three reasons. The first is burden fulfillment. I think it's disingenuous for opposition to claim that the burden for them is simply to prove that both of these franchises are scientifically not plausible or not scientifically sound on equal levels. There are two reasons why this is strange or not true. The first is it's impossible to compare two movies that come from different genres with different approaches and targeted to different demographics to equally say that they are sound or unsound at the exact same level, and therefore they fulfill their strange burden of the debate. But secondly, and more importantly, I don't think it was Edgecore's envision that opposition's burden is simply to prove that why Star Trek is to just accept that Star Wars is impossible, but Star Trek is also impossible to the same degree. Government team has never for even 1 second claimed that the franchise of Star Trek to be a documentary of scientific principles on every facet of all 13 movies. I think Catherine was quite clear in discussing the similarities of the existence of alien races which are not plausible, the fact that Spock is a human hybrid, or the fact that time travel and teleportation exists doesn't mean that these are examples that we choose to isolate. It's just examples that have no benefit to us having to prove why Star Trek is more plausible. If it is true that this debate is about the fact that Star Trek has teleportation or time travel, then they are supposed to explain why these are the facets of these movies that completely discredit all the other scientific elements of this movie that has made this movie to be more appreciative of its foundational roots in science. So I think it is for that specific reason why they fail to fulfill their burden, because they took no time in proving why there's some elements of Star Wars that outrank the plausibility of Star Trek, and why that means that this motion should fall. But secondly, about foundation, because another thing that they fail to take into due consideration is to what the meaning of foundation and explanation is. They tell you that explanation does not mean truth, and therefore it doesn't matter if some concepts are explained because they're exaggerated. I think this is not a contentious material, because this is something that I've already said in my speech. I've already told you about how these principles are exaggerated, but it doesn't matter because the foundation is based on a core principle of science. For example, the fact that atmospheric pressure exists means that you need to wear suits when you exit a spacecraft. The fact that different planets have different gravitational pulls and different atmospheric conditioning means that you need a suit and an oxygen tank to survive. But that does not mean that in Star Trek, because their oxygen tanks are small or their suits cannot withstand the pressure in the real world, that logic suddenly changes. The fact of the matter is that part is true and that part is plausible, and that means all we have to do is wait for better science to accrue where we can reach that stage. But the relevant point of this matter is that the attempt to explain and root the plot into of Star Trek is grounded on whether these processes are plausible or not, and that is something that they have yet to contest, or something that they have yet to reconcile. Final layer is the impact that Star Trek has created in real world technologies. The comparison shouldn't be about how we cherry pick examples of things like phasers used in plasma blasters, data being used as a blueprint for Stephen Hawking's voices modulator, or artificial gravity and deflectors used on the ISS. The fact of the matter is that these technologies exist because they are founded on key logical principles that can be applied 50 to 60 years after this franchise exists. All in all, Star Trek is a franchise that is still a fictional movie, a fictional franchise, but that does not negate all the possibilities of the scientific material that they had. To discredit them is to say as if Star Wars and Star Trek are on equal footing, which is just not the case. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
All right, thank you. The timing was 4 minutes and 37 seconds. 37. All right, so we have now come to the end of the debate. Debaters are asked to remain in this room while waiting for the adjudicators to make a decision. And adjudicators are reminded to move to the adjudicators discussion room in the Cisco WebEx via the link provided. With that, the House of Parliament is adjourned. Thank you.
Hi
Hi,
guys.
how's everyone doing?
Not
Okay.
bad. You all what first years ah?
Sorry?
Can you hear me? Can I?
What
Yeah,
first
I can
years?
hear you.
Oh.
First years or you all pre-U students?
I'm in my first year.
Are you guys the juniors? Like
Yeah,
first year
so
students?
yeah. So I'm in my first year. Finals are in 2 weeks, and my other teammates are in A levels.
What course you doing?
I'm doing biomedicine.
Biomedicine.
When I came to this debate, like this tournament, I was expecting STEM motions that I can flex my biomed knowledge on. So far, I've been able to do so.
That's the reason our coach sent us to this tournament also, because he's a biomedic. He's a associate professor in the biomedicine field. But we got Star Trek instead. So
I was expecting vaccines, like vaccine hesitancy or something like that, lah. But not
that was
Star
what
Trek.
we did in our. That is what we did in our prep.
Right.
You remember one motion we did, Kuhan? You remember what was it called? The type of vaccine creation. You remember the trial first in first out. What? You remember?
No.
cannot
The
remember.
Oh,
gain of function.
gain of function research. Yeah.
Function research. I died. I tell you, out of nowhere. Me and Catherine were OG, right? For me,
Yeah.
it was ridiculous.
Hey, no. I was with someone else. I wasn't.
I think I was with you, Ram. Was that
Yeah,
with you?
yeah.
Yeah, I was with you. Yeah.
Crazy. Gain of function research. Where the
Are you guys done with exams?
Sorry?
Final exams? Exams?
My finals are in 2 weeks. And
Oh.
I'm here debating instead of revising.
It's okay. They have finals Monday.
Glenn and I are in the middle of our finals right now. We have a paper
Yeah.
on Monday.
Yeah.
God bless your soul.
What to do? Our university tell us to go means cannot say no.
Yeah.
Because public tournament, what? So public university tournament. So
Is it an
Yeah.
obligation for UM to go to all public tournaments?
not an obligation to go to all, but the ones that the university flag and want us to go, we have to go lah. And the coach will decide who goes. So as much as I really don't want to be here,
I think our interactions are still being live streamed, right? But
Oh yeah. All the
Yeah,
chats
it is,
are
it is.
live. Yeah.
really, oh
yeah,
my
must
God,
filter Ram.
it's all a joke.
Yeah, it's all a joke.
I love being here.
Jangan-jangan aku hasutan je.
Shireen, if you don't mind me asking, what's your ethnicity?
Now this is a fun game I play every time I meet someone new. Take a guess. I'll give you a hint. It's a mix.
I will guess you're from East Malaysia.
No, I don't think she's fully Malaysian. She'll mix some other nationality. Am I correct?
Oh my God.
Ethnically, yes. I'm born in East Malaysia, but ethnically, I'm not East Malaysian.
Okay. I'm guessing. Actually, I don't know. But I feel like your features very Arabic like that.
Half Arab, correct.
Oh,
Correct?
Half Arab, yeah. Half Arab, half Chinese.
Oh.
Half
God,
Arab,
Kuhan
half
is
Chinese.
genius.
Yeah, quite a rare mix.
I was. If Kuhan didn't say anything, I was gonna say English.
I've gone
Really?
English before. I've gone Spanish, colonizer before. Yeah. But how did you guess East Malaysian?
No, because when you just spoke Malay, I could hear the accent.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
the
apa house
accent.
Spanish?
Are you?
Hi guys.
Spoke-
Hi guys. Sorry for interrupting. We've done adjudicating.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure.
If you don't mind, we
You
can
got
wrap it up.
later.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go on, sure, yeah.
I'm just following the instruction.
Okay,
Chairperson asked me
guys.
to put up.
I would like to say it was a great debate. It was a fun one to hear, coming up from both sides. Before I continue on, would you guys like your feedback directly here, or would you guys prefer it to have it in private? If you guys don't want it to be revealed to everyone, because this debate is also being streamed on YouTube.
Don't mind any general feedback, but if we have any questions, we will approach you after the debate is over. So yeah.
Okay, general
Yep,
feedback. Same. Okay, so I guess we're only be providing general feedback. Then later on, if you guys have any in-depth questions, we have our another educator here, Matthew. feel free to ask either one of us. Okay, so by unanimous vote, the win went to side government. Overall, from my side, I thought it was a very good debate. It was there were a lot of substantials coming in. From me personally, I felt like the government had a stronger stance and a more streamlined argument, which made more sense to me compared to the what was coming out of side opposition. I also feel like the side government did well in addressing the matter at hand and the issue and what should have been brought up. And I feel like side opposition, they were a little bit topsy turvy, but I think that also kind of falls down to the fact from what I heard, I feel like coming out from side government, you guys have a better understanding of the Star Trek and Star Wars universe compared to side opposition. So I guess that kind of helped because it really reflected in your arguments. But other than that's generally I feel like that's all from me. Matt, do you have anything to add on?
Yeah, all right. So, hello everyone. So the main thing that I would like to say in this debate, right? Like, what did it really boil down to? It basically boiled down to what are we trying to prove in this debate? So as we can see, the motion states that, the scientific feasibility of Star Trek and Star Wars. So we have one side right off the bat trying to say that Star Trek has scientific elements that might be over-exaggerated in certain cases, but at the end of the day, there is still solid science that can be backed up. While the other side came up saying right off the very bat that both sides are equally unrealistic. So when you look at the context of the debate, you have one side trying to show that yes, Star Trek does have science, which proves that its feasibility is better because we're talking about which one is more scientifically sound compared to Star Wars. While the other side is coming up and saying that both sides have inconsistencies and both sides are unrealistic in terms of sciences. So there were two very different cases that were trying to be proven by each side. So we have to look which side managed to prove their case the best. So side government came off the very bat saying that yes, they did acknowledge, they did concede to the fact that there are elements that are exaggerated. Because at the end of the day, it's a movie, it's a series, you're trying to appeal to public. So yes, there will be exaggerated. This is not a scientific documentary. However, at the end of the day, when you look back at behind everything that goes on, there is actually solid science principle. Okay, maybe not solid, but in a way that it can still be explained and has been explained in the course of the series. So one is you have explanation, you have scientific terms, you have scientific background that is being used. While you look at Star Wars, the entire universe of Star Wars is all built upon the idea of fantasy. So you have one science fantasy and you have one science fiction. The word science is in both of it. So there is an element of science, but which one is more scientifically sound? That is the argument at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, side government has managed to show that yes, although their side and their paradigm has elements of exaggeration just as well as Star Wars, but side government shows that the exaggeration is only for the value of entertainment, but at the end, at the very beginning, you do have the science. You do have solid science background. So it's regardless of how many times you throw around the word quantum physics or how you try to explain it in all those, because this is not a scientific debate to the very core. We're trying to see which one has a scientific background, which one of these series or movies has a scientific backing to it. So if to come up and say that both of them are equally unrealistic, then the debate would shift to which one is slightly more realistic then. So basically at the end of the day, you're still trying to show which side is better than the other. To bring down the status quo to where both sides are unrealistic just negates the whole debate in itself, because then what are we trying to prove at the end of the day? We are trying to say that Star Trek is more scientifically sound than Star Wars. So you can either come up and show us how Star Wars is more scientifically sound than Star Trek, or how both of them on the basis of scientifically sound are the same or not the same. So that is where the principle should have been. And that was very clear coming up from the second speaker of side government. So the foundation was already there to show that what you have to prove moving in this debate. So this is why we decided to give the win to side government, because we believe that at the end of the day, side government managed to prove that their case, while talking about Star Trek and acknowledging Star Wars, they show how Star Trek has a somewhat stronger scientific backing to it compared to Star Wars. So this is not taking into the examples of the blasters versus phasers or time travel versus teleportation, because all those are specific plot devices that we decided to pick out. When we look at the overall picture, we can see that the overall picture has a sense of showing the government side, the government point of view has a more solid scientific backing compared to the opposition point of view. So that is why I gave the verdict to side government as well.
All right, I feel like that wraps up our ni. Most of us are all on the same page with Matt on this one. But however, if you guys want more in-depth review on your own speeches and everything, you please contact us, get our information from the chairperson. And with that, I think that wraps up today's debate. Congratulations to those, and don't give up. You guys have another 2 rounds, and all the best for the upcoming rounds for the 2 of you.
Hello, how can we approach you for personal feedback?
Get in contact with the chairperson. The chairperson will give our numbers.
Okay. How do I contact the chairperson?
Chairperson's right there. You can ask her.
Okay.
Yeah. Or you can ask in the group also.
Okay, I will ask in the group chat.
Oh yeah, Shireen, I'll make it easy for you. I will also plug in my Instagram so that it'll be easier for you to get.
Besides, Matthew is EdgeCore. Whenever you join the Cisco web, you can just talk to Matthew.
All right, sure.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Nice debate.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Congratulations.
Next round is at 2, right? Okay.
Yep. The roll call is at 2.
Okay.
All right. Good luck for the next round.
Thank you.